Well, greetings, friends. Welcome to a long form of the Danielle Smith Show. I'm going to be trying to do these on a weekly basis. So if you've got some really interesting newsmaker or thought leader that you want me to speak to, this is the time for us to do it because I do like the interactivity. I am going to try to monitor the text line a little bit more, but sheesh. I went into the locals community because of the vitriol that we see in social media. What is wrong with everybody on social media? You're very angry. Let's see if we can have a respectful conversation today and see if we can get to the bottom of some pretty important issues. Because I want to talk to you, number one, about health reform. Many of you have been asking what my ideas are on healthcare reform. And we also want to talk about how we can renew our relationship with Canada. It has been my position for some time that if we were to put the conditions on the table that we have right now for Alberta to join with the rest of the country, would we sign on to this particular deal? Would we sign on to only having 6 Senate seats when Nova Scotia and New Brunswick have 10? Would we sign on to Quebec in perpetuity, no matter what their population being, having a certain number of seats, even though our population is growing? Would we sign on to $27 billion or more every year going to support the rest of our fellow countrymen while we continue to barely scrape by with surpluses or even run deficits? Would we put up with that? Would we sign on to the federal government coming to us on every single area of our jurisdiction and offering us pennies on the dollar and then telling us they want total control over how we run our programs, whether it's healthcare or now childcare, or they want to get into long-term care and pharmaceutical care? I don't think we'd sign on to that deal. So my first guest today for this new type of platform has lots to say on both of these issues. And I will give some of my own thoughts as we go through this, but I want to give him his full due, because you've probably heard me talk and write about health spending accounts. And I never personally had a health spending account until I got into government. This is sort of the interesting thing, isn't it? So many of you who have been in large corporations probably have had one of these mechanisms in in part of your benefits package for some time. But I'll tell you how it works in the public service. Someone will have to correct me if there's somebody on the line who's in one of the unions. But often the way they structure the pay and benefits that politicians get is they want it to be roughly equivalent to what is offered in the public service. So I can only assume that every member of the public service had the same thing we did. As I said, someone will correct me if I'm wrong. But when we got in, they had a health spending account that was had an amount, an allocation of $950. It's pretty high, right? I'm such a loser. I didn't know how to use it. So I think we only ever withdrew it for David to get glasses and his optometry visit. And the interesting part about how it was structured is it was structured as use it or lose it. So once you got to the end of the year, if you hadn't used it, it would just reset to zero. And then you'd get a new setting. So a pretty substantial benefit if you think about it. Now, the other thing about health spending accounts, because you're sort of probably scratching your head, because we keep getting told that all we have is a publicly funded system. But as we know, we do already have a lot of private delivery in healthcare. And there's a lot of services that are not covered by our publicly funded system. The Canada Health Act has 5 principles in it. I wonder if I can list them off the top of my head. So universality is one of the principles. Public administration is another one of the principles. Accessibility, how accessible is it? They seem to have looked at the lens of accessibility as whether or not you have to pay for access, as opposed to whether or not you're sitting waiting on a waiting list. There's portability as well, and comprehensiveness. So again, lots of things aren't covered by healthcare. So what a health spending account does is that it allows you dollars in your account to pay for all the things that are not covered by the publicly funded program. And so think about that for yourself, about the things that you have had to pay out of pocket for. Things like laser eye surgery, things like braces, which I've had 3 times. Things like there's some people, if you don't have a pharmaceutical plan, you'd be able to pay out of a health spending account. There are physiotherapy, chiropractic, massage therapy, dietitians, naturopath, and a bunch of different other implements too. So when you look at the range of things you can pay for out of a health spending account, it does make you realize that there actually is an awful lot that isn't covered by the publicly funded healthcare system. The publicly funded healthcare system principally covers hospital services and doctors' services. So if you want to think about where the dividing line, that seems to be the dividing line. But here's the thing. So that's my first experience that I had with the health spending account. And send me a text or a note in the side here as we're chatting, so I can find out about your personal experience. But it occurred to me, if our Alberta Public Service already has health spending accounts, that actually should be a good place to start when we're doing reform. If it's good enough for those who are in the public service to have access to a little bit of money so that they can pay for the healthcare needs and their own priorities, why wouldn't we make that kind of approach available to everyone? Now, the seed got planted about how to transform healthcare by my guest today. His name is Gordon Tulk, and I want to give you his background, because some of you who have gone to the United Conservative Party conventions will know that Gordon Tulk has a lot to say on almost every policy issue. Actually, literally every policy issue. It was very funny. I went to the UCP convention in the fall. It was Gordon and one other gentleman who got up and almost had dueling mics going on. I don't know if you guys plan that you have opposite takes on every policy issue.
No, we don't plan that.
But it was very hilarious. You guys seem to.
Yeah.
But let me give a more formal introduction to the kind of things that you're doing, so that people will understand why you have such an interest in this area, because you've given a ton of thought to policy issues, and I want to make sure that people know the full breadth of it. You're born and raised in Western Newfoundland. After earning a degree in agriculture from the University of Guelph, you worked in various agriculture jobs in Ontario, Newfoundland, and BC before moving to the Red Deer area in 1999 as an insurance broker, providing financial security advice and products to small business. And since early childhood, you've been passionate regarding politics and policy. Now, off the air, I was talking to you about why how you first got interested in politics and in the renewing the relationship between Ottawa and Alberta in particular. And as a Western Newfoundlander, you said one of your first experience happened when you got to present to the Charest Commission. So tell us a little bit about that story, because I think it's going to frame a lot of our discussion.
Yeah, I locked horns with Jean Charest. This was during the Meech Lake debacle, and I worked actually quite closely, as I was saying off camera, with Clyde Wells and Deborah Coyne. There are people I'm sure who are listening to this remember those names, and I was vehemently against Meech Lake, primarily because of the injustice it was going to create with the distinct society and basically giving Quebec a veto over everything in the future, and not having a Triple-E Senate, which I think is frankly the only way this country survives long term. And so I appeared before the Charest Commission back in '89. It was my first public speaking appearance ever. And I went for 10 minutes, and it was live national TV. And at the end, I basically looked over at the Bloc Québécois member of the commission. I told them, one day the demographics of this country are going to change, and we're going to say to hell with you. And that got recorded and answered. But as I say this, I can feel my blood pressure rising as to how upset I was at that time, and how you look back and the demographics have changed. Mm-hmm. This country is vastly different now. I was just talking to somebody the other day about, clearly you've been down to the Lower Mainland. Burnaby in 1989 was 77% Anglo of British origin. 77%. Well, if you go to Burnaby today, it's nothing like that demographically. It's probably 80% visible minorities. And that, frankly, that part of Canada doesn't give a rat's rear end, if I can use that term, about the distinct society of Quebec. Trying to tell somebody who's from the Cantonese province in China that they're not distinct, that somebody is more distinct than they are, is frankly an affront. And as a Newfoundlander, I resented it too. But
I'm
That got
surprised
me.
that you got away with unparliamentary language,
Yeah,
like using the word hell, but you can use rat's ass on here if you
yeah,
want
yeah.
to as well. But the interesting part about that is the demographics have absolutely changed in the rest of the country.
Absolutely.
But the francophone character of Quebec, I wonder, in some ways, it seems to me that it may have strengthened because of all of the onerous legislation that they brought in with the sign laws, and now with their most recent anti-religious symbols law, and the control over their immigration to give priority to the francophone language. And I don't know that the English minority in Quebec has been able to enjoy the same level of rights and flourishment that we've seen in multiple communities outside of Quebec. So maybe there's just a different reality there.
I I haven't spent a lot of time in Quebec lately. Certainly had a lot of dealings with Quebec when I lived down in Eastern Canada, in Newfoundland. Um, I think you could argue some respects it's stronger, but I think it's also weaker because of its the repercussions of the xenophobic uh, tools they put in place. And I find it very ironic that Quebecers are massive NFL football fans. They are massive fans of Americana. They don't have the same priors that we have in the English side of Canada, being reflexively anti-American in that regard. Their reflexive actions are against us as opposed to the United States, and I suspect culturally they're a lot weaker. I've had lots of conversations with Newfoundlanders from the demographic. The demographics have changed down there a lot, and actually, I would argue that Newfoundland is a far weaker place spiritually and culturally than it was 30 years ago, and certainly 50 years ago.
The reason why Quebec's attitude matters towards the rest of Canada is really important. I hadn't heard you describe it that way, but it does explain to me why there's such a large population of Quebecers that like to travel down to Florida.
Yeah, Florida, yeah, big time.
That's a big
They
place.
love Americana. They can't get enough of it. I mean,
But if there's this underlying resentment against English Canada, the reason that becomes so problematic is that with policies of distinct society and official bilingualism, and where our capital city is situated on the Ottawa-Hull border,
Mhm.
you end up with a very large number of the federal civil service that is from Quebec. And so they would have, you'd assume, their attitudes towards the rest of Canada would be very reflective of what you see in Quebec as a whole. And that creates all kinds of problems, because if there's this vision of how the country ought to work that comes from one province's perspective, it kind of explains why there isn't the same respect for regional diversity and provincial diversity that they would ask for themselves. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, as you know, if you want an opinion, I'll give you one.
I know you will.
I have lots. I think it was Michael Bliss. You recall Michael Bliss talking about the new Canada and the old Canada. He's put that marker line somewhere around the Manitoba-Ontario border. I think it's actually much closer to Bloor Street and west of there. I think, if anything, the new Canada has moved slightly to the west or to the east. But you're dealing with, and lots of people have written about the Laurentian elites. I look at Canada and the formation of Canada and how it proceeded, and we see trappings of it all around, and compare it to the United States. The United States is an agrarian economy. The United States is close, corner to corner to corner to corner. I think that's four corners, agrarian. And to farm, you have to have a bank nearby. You have to go and buy your tools, buy your seed, have some place to deliver your food, your things to market. And if you look at the American economy, their banking system, their regulatory systems are all much more diffuse. Look at Canada. Canada is originally a hinterland economy that was based at the headwaters in Montreal and the headwaters at the Humber River in Toronto, and the upper and lower Canada. And what does it take to support fur trade in terms of infrastructure? Nothing, right? Guys are making birch bark canoes, right? They've got local guides, right? You take a few beads, a few blankets, and you've got an ability to run a company. So you literally deputized the Hudson Bay Company in the beginning, and then ultimately you deputized five major banks, to be the Bank of Canada representatives out west and out east of the true capital of the old Canada was Montreal, not Toronto or Ottawa for that matter. And that hinterland viewpoint perspective still exists. I look at Jean Charest, I still see a guy who believes that It's the center of Canada that matters the most. Apocryphally, possibly, but it's been so long. I remember during the constitutional wrangles back when we were repatriating, or whatever you want to call it, and Joe Clark famously said he saw Canada as a string of pearls, of 10 equal pearls. And somebody asked Pierre Trudeau what he thought of that comment. And Pierre Trudeau said, "I see Canada as a gold chain with 2 diamonds in the middle." Right?
And what were the diamonds?
The diamonds being Ontario and Quebec.
Huh.
And we were the gold chain that was going to feed into that. So a hinterland economy feeds into that central core. That was the principal precept, if you will, of the National Energy Program. That's the National Energy Program was going to pull that wealth that was being generated in Western Canada and was looking to be generated. And that's what got me frosted back in the day. Was we were on the verge of a boom with Hibernia and all those developments on our coast, and we were fearful. Brian Peckford certainly was irate about it, that we were going to see a national energy program imposed on us, and all the wealth that we build up and grow funnels into Ontario and Quebec. And we're seeing it again, right? What's the carbon tax, right? Why is Trudeau reflexively trying to stunt and hobble Alberta and BC? Because he sees them as a threat to their hinterland model of the economy, and the Laurentian Elites are threatened. That's a bigger conversation.
No, I don't know if you've ever seen this map, and I don't know if it's accurate. That's why I wanted to ask you about it.
Sure.
But it's a map of Canada, and it draws a line at the 49th parallel. And so you end up with the little jut of Montreal and Toronto, I think, below the 49th parallel. And it says that 50% of Canada's population lives below this line.
It's a bigger number than that.
Is it bigger than that? So what is
I
that?
mean,
It's sort of remarkable, because then you see truly the way you're describing it, this hinterland economy, you see all of this territory that is very lowly populated.
Yeah. And we're, like I said, the United States is this gigantic square. And people say, well, Canada's a bigger country than geographically. Canada, from an economic standpoint, is just this ribbon about maybe at its deepest parts where we are right now. But for the most part, it's 5 miles inside of north of the American border, and that's it. That is what it is. But the thing is, in the last 30 years, look at the economic might that's come out of Alberta, even more than was already at the time. You look at the demographic shifts, the population shifts, and just the sheer the miracle. I don't know how up our viewers are on what everybody talks about Canada being the great compromiser, and nothing could be further from the truth. The Great Compromise, the actual term Great Compromise, when you look it up in Wikipedia and elsewhere, refers to the convention in Philadelphia, and the compromise was over what? It was over a Triple E Senate. They battled it for 6 months. It was the one thing in the room that nobody ever wanted to deal with, was that the small states in the 13 said, we need equality somewhere at the federal level. And there's actually, I remember watching an old PBS episode where they reenacted the scene, and basically New Jersey had double-crossed a couple of the smaller states, and they were literally going to walk out the door, and Benjamin Franklin physically blocked the door and wouldn't let them leave, and pleaded with the larger states and said, if this is what's going to happen, this what we fought for, this declaration we wrote, ends if we don't compromise on this. And they compromised.
And it's remarkable too.
And the United States doesn't exist today. The greatest, frankly, in my opinion, the greatest, most powerful, most beneficial country ever created in all of humanity. And what did we do in Canada? Well, number one, we ran away from it. My ancestors ran away from it to Ontario. Ran away from the greatest idea in human history, which is the Declaration of Independence, and then the Constitution that arose from it. And then we have a Meech Lake and all these other rounds, and we never got to that point where we said, you know what, if we're going to hold this country together long term, we have to recognize the equality of the provinces at the federal level.
So let's talk about that, because I think it gets into your really kind of key idea about how we should rethink Canada, because it's hard to imagine how America has been able to agree that a state with 30 million people, which I think is what California is roughly, would have the same
31, 32.
31 million. Okay, would have the same
It's getting
number.
smaller every day, Danielle. It's hard to say.
Well, of course, they're all going to Florida.
They're all leaving, yes.
Or Texas.
Texas, yeah.
But then the smallest state, I think, is Rhode Island, which has, tell me how many
no,
population?
it's Wyoming.
Wyoming.
Physically, Rhode Island. No, actually, Delaware would be smaller.
Population, smallest
Here
state.
we are debating geography, but in terms of population, it's Wyoming.
And what is it?
540,000.
Okay, so let's just put this on the table, because that's one of the barriers we've had in this country is how can you equalize a 31 million population with a 500,000 population? We've got a similar application. Should PEI with 100,000 people have the same number of senators as Ontario with, call it 14 million, or Alberta with 4.5 million? That it's hard to get over that barrier. I mean, America grew into it when they made their decisions back in the 1700s. Maybe they never foresaw that California and Florida would be such high populations. They might not agree to it if they'd known. But we are now in a situation where we do have these disparities. And how do you get people over the idea that PEI should have the same voice?
You can tell by my eagerness. I hope maybe people can see, as enthusiastic as I am about healthcare reform and equalization reform. Let me first pose the question that I asked you. I remember a while ago, I asked anybody who I respect in terms of their opinion on this, and some people who understand the dynamics of this country. I'll ask the viewers, listeners, do you think Canada can survive long term without reforming the Senate? And I'm pretty sure most people would say, no, it cannot.
Can I tell you what my answer would be? My answer would be, I think that the Senate's unreformable, because we had people like Burt Brown and Ted Morton who just gave it the good old college try. Let me map this out, and then you can counter me.
Sure. Okay.
So I think we've had great reformers who are strong voices who gave it the try. We even had politicians who would appoint our elected senators, like Dan Waters, and then Burton and others got appointed. But then we switch back to the Liberals, and they ignore our Senate elections. We've just done a Senate election, and people ask me if I was going to run. I said, well, why? Like, you put all this effort in and you're never going to get appointed anyway. So I have looked at our country as the counterbalance isn't the Senate. The counterbalance is a strong provincial premier, that all of the premiers have to assert their voice in having the Constitution work the way it was intended. So that would be my answer. So tell me why you think I'm wrong.
Okay. First off, you're saying it's unreformable. I think that, and just full disclosure, I'm part of Libertas, Alberta. We created, and our whole efforts are to come up with policies and ideas and solutions that are politically workable. It's no point to talk about a political solution if it's not a goal we can get to, and healthcare reform is very much part of that as well. So let's back up a sec. If you look at, in the United States, California's 30 million and Wyoming's 500,000 or whatever it is. So maybe somebody can text and give us the actual numbers. And Ontario is 11, 12, 13 million now, and PEI is 110, 120,000. So the city of Red Deer plus Sylvan Lake. The ratio, largest province to smallest province, is more extreme in the United States than it is in Canada. Okay. On the largest to smallest. But if you took the majority you require, so in the United States, to have a majority, and it's saying you need 25 states plus one to sway power. If you look at the math there, it's about 36% of the population would be 25 states, 25 smallest states. In Canada, it's less than 20. And in another 15 years, it'll be around 12 or 13%. The point being is that the bigger provinces have an argument to be made here that the power balance is outrageous, and it's getting worse if we allow a Triple E Senate. And they're right on that. And what my counter is to that, you can't just address the Senate. You have to address, what does it mean to be a province? And why are we hide binding our geographic provincial boundaries on stuff that was agreed to 100 and whatever the heck years ago, 150 years ago in 1867. PEI was a much more important player and a much more dynamic populist base in relation to the rest of Canada. Alberta had how many people, right? I mean, in terms of setting aside the Aboriginals that were there at the time. So the demographics have changed, and we have to have some kind of a mechanism that says, you know what, if you're below a certain population relative to the rest of Canada for a 20, 25-year period, you cease to be a province. You become a territory. You lose your Senate seats. You get one Senate seat. On the flip side, if you're a province and you can organize and delineate a part of the population of that province that's 5% of the overall national population, you should be able to become a new province. Let the GTA become a province.
I need you to pause here, because what you're putting forward is a pretty radical redrafting of our geography. And so I want to make sure that people understand. Just give me 1 second. I don't know if anybody has come back to us and told us what the population of these two states are. No one has. Laura, I'm just going to make a note to our technical producer. If there's an interesting comment that comes up, just make sure you flash it on the screen so that everyone can see it. But what I find interesting is, because it is the case that when you are born into a certain geographic structure, you think that's going to last forever. It's kind of it's miraculous to imagine the forging of our two nations. At one point, we were Rupert's Land, right? And then we had different denominations, and as we got higher population and more development, provinces emerged. We didn't emerge in Alberta till 1905, and Saskatchewan, same thing. So what you're proposing is, I want to think that through. So you're saying that probably under this scenario, PEI would become a territory and would lose some of its provincial status, would be a bit more of a ward and require more federal intervention. But then it's not to say that every province would stay the way it is. The provinces would be divided into multiple different provinces based on different populations. So walk me across the country, if you could, and tell me, based on what you've seen and what you've looked at, how many provinces could we have in Canada based on what you're proposing?
Okay. So let me just, these kinds of frictions are happening in the US as well. You're seeing separatist movements in California. You're seeing people in northern New York saying we should separate from Manhattan and places like that. My dog's making noises over there.
It's okay. It's a hazard now.
She's having nightmares about Canada in the next years if we don't fix it. So what we proposed, and obviously these are points of discussion in Libertas, was this needs to be a very slow process. That it'll be 25 years before PEI is essentially put on notice that they're below a certain level, and they get another 25 years to get their act together and either find a way to grow the population, or maybe they cut a deal with New Brunswick and become part of New Brunswick. All those calculations happen. So this isn't like tomorrow we're going to have it. We're not going to draw a line through northern India and call it Pakistan and have a civil war over it. But over the long term, you could see the Atlantic provinces essentially becoming maybe two provinces: New Brunswick and PEI, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador. You could see Quebec divide into three, right? You could see Ontario divide into 5 entities. You could have a capital in London, a capital in Toronto, a capital in North Bay for all of northwestern Ontario. And then you've got what we call the capital region now, that giant money pot where we pay big amounts of money to blow snow off the Rideau Canal into another province. You could see Alberta becoming two provinces. You could see BC becoming the Lower Mainland. You could see Vancouver Island becoming a province one day, potentially. So instead of being 10 hidebound, locked in irritants to the whole harmony system, place that resists the flux that we need to have happening to keep the country going together, staying together, allowing these provinces to evolve and devolve. It's interesting, when I brought these conversation points up, the group that got most irate, and you're judged by the people who agree with you, and you're even better judged by the people who disagree. The people who got most irate are the separatists of Quebec. They cannot stand this, because they know if this became the rule of the land, Montreal, the island of Montreal, and a little bit of the Lower Mainland or the Eastern Townships would leave tomorrow, right?
They would form their own province tomorrow.
Oh, in a heartbeat. If you think GTA wants to be its own province, in the Greater Toronto area, or the Lower Mainland muses about it, hey, let's cut off BC at Hope, and the heck with all those rednecks in Kelowna and Vernon. The Montreal is so culturally different from Quebec City and the Beauce regions and those areas. They would leave in a heartbeat. And that's the divide and conquer strategy, frankly. It's not a strategy or a tactic, but it's the result. By dividing that separatist nationalist force in Quebec, you make them weaker, that you make them more of an interested, vested party in staying and keeping Canada together.
Well, talk to me about how that would impact resource development. So I'm trying to think, because
That's
I
a good
think you're
question.
quite right. Some people do want, I think the more urbanized we become
Yep.
and the more authority that urban centers have to take over, because let's face it, I mean, when you get into any of our big cities, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, probably Regina, Saskatoon to some degree, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal. Let's just use those ones. There, you end up with more demands for services, more complexity in delivering services. You've got transit systems, you've got mental health issues, you've got homeless issues. All of those are integrated. There's a lot more involvement that the municipal councils have to go across jurisdictions. So I can see why, if you're in a big city, you may think, hey, we're doing a lot of the work that should be provincial anyway, so let's become a province. However, then you have to have more rational policies about how you're going to fuel
Yep.
your economy and get your energy. And you're going to then have to negotiate with your neighbors about how to get your food and how to get oil and gas.
You have
And I
to get
wonder if
along.
that would create a healthier discussion.
I think it does. It makes us all mutually dependent on one another. And I would also point out that as much as, excuse me, the GTA would want to separate, how would you like to be in Sudbury if you could, hey, we can keep all our mineral resource revenues in Northern Ontario, not have them go to Toronto and get wasted on subway systems in Toronto. I mean, that's, I mentioned the hinterland thing, but we're all basically riverheads, right? And the cities are the headwaters. Or not the headwaters. The headwaters? No, the other way. There's the inlet and the outlet,
There's the
right?
downstream. Yeah.
The downstream, right?
Downstream of the
And what
headwaters.
I
Sure.
find people in big centers like the GTA and the GVA, Vancouver, is even more lacking in understanding that what drives their economy isn't the law firms that make all the money in Vancouver and Toronto and elsewhere, and the banks in Toronto. They're managing the banking needs of us upstream. And the only reason why we deal with them is that they're at kind of the river at the downstream point. And because they've got a system like in Ontario where they control all of it, and they have the population to politically control it, it all gets run for their benefit. I mean, the injustices that we see across Canada, Alberta versus what's going on in Eastern Canada, those injustices happen within provinces too.
Well, I want to talk about that too. So
Yeah.
the vision that you're painting, let's say that we could get up to 20 different provinces.
Sure.
Now you're having a legitimate discussion about how many senators you can have. Because it never, if you wanted to follow the American model, having 2 senators per province, do you really want only 20 people deciding on pretty important issues? If you ended up having 20 provinces, maybe you get 4 senators from each province. Now you're at 100 people. Now you've got some kind of parity to the US. Is that how you would see it working?
I could see it being something like 6 or 8 per province. One gets elected every 2 years, and they have 6-year terms, something like that. So you're always, the biggest thing is you want those Senate seats to senators. You want to make it impossible for whoever is the ruling party federally to outlast all the senators in a certain province so that they're able to manipulate and control. So if it takes 18 years to turn over all the senators, you're not going to probably stay in power. It's the same thing on the provinces. I used to be very wedded to the idea of those senators being elected. I'm kind of okay if you had that kind of setup. You leave it up to the provinces to decide how they want to pick their senators.
But interesting. I see what you're saying, though.
Yeah.
It should be a provincial appointee as 100%. Opposed to federal appointee.
I guess in the States, I'd be called an originalist, I think, or a constructionist view of the Constitution. Provincial jurisdiction is provincial jurisdiction. Federal jurisdiction is federal jurisdiction. And you don't meddle in the other's business. I very much hope that, and I guess I pray, that Pierre Poilievre is the next prime minister of this country. And I do trust him that he feels the same way, that we need to get the federal government out of provincial jurisdiction. And the way they do it is things like the Canada Health Act, where they're writing rules because they have the fundraising capacity to tell the provinces what to do. I think.
Okay, I don't want to leave to healthcare yet, because
sorry.
we're going to have a huge conversation.
Right.
But I just want people whose minds have now been blown to
Sure.
kind of really think through what this would mean in the alliances we've formed.
If I might, Danielle.
Yeah,
so the reason why you bring that out is that the biggest thing to get any constitutional change done is we need what? We need 50% of the population in 7 of the provinces.
Yeah.
Once you bring in the idea that the quid pro quo on this is triple, if you want an equal Senate provincially, we're going to also change what it means to be a province. So then Ontario says, okay, then that means PEI is gone. That means Newfoundland and Nova Scotia become one. So we see a consolidation happening there. You're going to have BC sign on. You're going to have Alberta sign on. Manitoba, I'm sure, is going to go along for it, as is Saskatchewan. That's 4. Ontario is 5. I firmly believe that there are some smart people in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia who would say, this is a really, really good thing for us. And now we're at 7 and we've got well over 50%. And you take it to Quebec and say, this is the way it's going to be. Like I say, the demographics of this country have changed. You and I both remember the big crisis that Chrétien caused, and we had this vote, and Brian Tobin and all these other clowns went down there and they're Captain Canada are going to save the country. If we ever had that kind of a referendum crisis, either here in Alberta or in Quebec, that's not going to happen again. We're not going to say save Canada. We're going to say, okay. Right. So
let me I'm still trying to think through what a couple of these things would mean. So when we talk about I've been thinking about this for some time, because initially you talked to me about it and I thought, from a practicality point of view, how difficult it would be to implement. But the way you describe it with the amending formula, there is a pathway that's possible, especially if you've got a prime minister who has also come to the conclusion that this country isn't working as well as it was intended.
So I want to explain how, or what I think, why the conditions are approaching this. Okay.
And before you get there, the question I wanted to ask you is, what about the Laurentian Elite? So are they going to have their own separate province? And who are the Laurentian Elite exactly? Is it essentially just draw a line between Toronto and Montreal and everybody who lives within that corridor? Is that who we're talking about when we talk about the Laurentian Elite? Or because that term gets used a lot, but I don't know if people know exactly what the geography is, and who those folks are.
Certainly historically, it was that axis up and down the Ottawa River, and it all goes back to resource extraction and fur trade and all of that stuff. And all the banking systems were there, all the law firms were there. There were no lawyers in Red Deer, but beyond that, it's had its satellites, if you will. Of elites who are, benefit from that. And you see vestiges of it in Vancouver, you see vestiges of it in Ontario, in Halifax, to some degree in St. John's, where, they're part of that, they're like not branch plants, but they're kind of just a little outposts that very much benefit and agree.
Not Calgary, Edmonton? I would
not as much. There's some of it for sure. I would say Edmonton, there's a fairly decent cohort. I mean, you deal with that elitist, but I think when there's Laurentian and there's elite, and I think that there's a tearing down of all the elites in every sector on the planet, and when anything is threatened, like the Laurentian elites, I think really see themselves as being threatened.
So it's interesting though, because look at the model you're talking about, Gord. Like you're talking about a model where the extractive regions and extractive industries have been established to essentially feed the centers. Now, this new model you're proposing is that those regions and those resource development, they would have autonomy in their own right, which would be an extraordinary way of changing the country. Can you just bring it closer to home for me about how it would work in Alberta in particular? I'm wondering where the dividing line would be, because I wonder if Fort McMurray would want to be its own country, because it's certainly got its own resources, or if the dividing line, when you say north-south, would Edmonton and that whole northern region, you think that might be a separate province?
I would expect that there would be a determination movement that would say, let's be a province north of Red Deer, because then we get to keep the resource revenues coming out of the oil sands in our area, as opposed to flowing all the way down to Calgary and out around. those, I'm not here to dictate what those lines are and draw those lines, far from it. I think you need to be able to give people the ability to become those entities. One of the big struggles in the United States, for example, is there's a big couple of chunks of California that would separate tomorrow if they were not required to get the permission of the state of California. And state of California, of course, is blocking that effort. One of the things is that if, let's say, the GTA wanted to separate from the rest of Ontario, that the rest of Ontario would not be able to say, no, you can't, right? So self-determination obviously is a huge thing in the world. And
it is remarkable. So you wanted to say why you think that we're sort of heading to some kind of an inevitability that we've got to have some kind of restructuring discussion.
Well,
and I don't disagree with you. I mean, I worry that if we don't proactively come up with some ideas about how to make things work better, then there's going to be, and I've already seen it. I'm watching, there's a number of different groups that are out there holding town hall meetings and discussions about, do you want to have nation within a nation? Do you want more autonomy? Do you want to separate? These are active conversations that are taking place all over Alberta right now. And I have a different view. If you want to know my view, I would like to see, and maybe it's funny, conservatives do tend to like to see bigger rather than smaller. There's been the Buffalo Project is a proposal that maybe Alberta and Saskatchewan need to combine rather than be separate. Or maybe we need to look at the West as a whole as a way that we can coordinate together from Thunder Bay all the way through to Port of Prince Rupert. So that's been my frame of reference. So I think you're right. Something is coming. And I want to understand why you think that these forces are a bit unstoppable.
Well, was it Parizeau used the term winning conditions? Was that his phrase?
It was, yeah.
Yeah. So I see the landscape, especially in Alberta, but I'm seeing it in Saskatchewan. I think you'd agree, and I think in BC there's some fomenting, certainly in the interior. There's three groups. The groups. There's where my core is. I think we can save confederation. I think there is a way to fix it, using an equalizing at the Senate level. I see your camp, Danielle, that's more a sovereignty association. We have powers within the Constitution currently. Let's maximize them and use them to their fullest and create a fortress, if you will, to push back. And certainly Alberta has a history of doing that. The ATB, Alberta Treasury Branch, was an attempt to push back against what was happening in the banking system in Canada, and still exists. ATB and the injustices of the banking system of Canada. And then there's another group that frankly says, we're out of here. The best place for us to be is out of Canada. Some say we should also be part of the US, but we need to be out of Canada. Those three groups tactically all share the same tactics. You want to see a more assertive Alberta government that pulls all the levers. Paul Hinman and the Wildrose Independence Party, they want to do the same thing. And I want to see Alberta be far more assertive, push hard against equalization, push hard for individual taxes, our own banking system, our own police force, all those things. Because it furthers my goal, it furthers yours, and it furthers the separatists. And it's not just in Alberta, it's Saskatchewan and other areas. So we all share the same tactics. We have different strategic desires. But that means our strategies ultimately will weld in terms of going, okay, we've got to create the crisis, right, to make the next thing happen. And that's what we're trying to do. And what I mean by crisis is the Hinge, and Ontario people will tell you this all the time. They see themselves as the keystone of this country. Ontarians long believe that we are the heart of this country. We are, and geographically they certainly are. We are the kind of the stabilizing force in this country. But if they see Alberta and Saskatchewan getting further and further more aggressively towards leaving and hitting the exits, Ontario's got a choice to make. Ontario's got to say, Quebec, trying not to swear, stuff's going to happen here. We've got to accommodate these people. We've got to make changes in the Constitution to save this confederation and save what we see as being the heart of the country, or we're going to have to go with these guys. I think if push came to shove, Ontario goes with Western Canada. Ontario does not stay with the rump of Canada, frankly. I'll probably get quoted on that, which would be Quebec and the Atlantic provinces, which right now economically certainly are the rump. So
If it was to work out the way you described, where let's
yes,
call it 20 provinces and we have an
peace and
equal
harmony.
Senate, and as you've described, I understand now why you think more like 6, so that you can have 2 senators every
Mhm.
6 years, so that you can have a longer, more stable turnover. I get that. Where would the capital city be? I've always felt like it was situated in the wrong
Of
place
the
anyway.
country,
I'd be quite happy for it to be in Winnipeg. It seems a little more fair that it'd be actually right dead center in our country.
that has been proposed in the past. I am totally okay with Winnipeg, and I'll tell you why. Okay, and it's funny. We always talked about in Newfoundland. We should put the for those Newfoundlanders that we used to use it. The best place to have the capital Newfoundland was Birchie Lake, which was kind of the center of Newfoundland. Beautiful area, really good fishing and all that kind of stuff. But the reason why you want to put it in Winnipeg is because nobody wants to live there. That's the perfect place to have a capital.
Okay, except
No,
for Winnipeggers, they love to live there.
no,
In the
no.
summer, that little Forks area is quite amazing,
I
and they've
kid.
got beautiful
I kid in a
architecture.
way, but we don't want, Winnipeg. I'm totally okay with it being in the center of there. The point being is that I don't know. That was a nasty thing to say. I
No, but I
apologize.
know what you mean is that you want to you don't want it to become a government town, and
Yes,
for it to be, because there is such a desire to move there, we end up with more government than we could possibly
sure.
want, because
And with
under your model, we want our government
sure.
to be back in the regions principally.
And with 20 provinces or whatever, which are much smaller, much more diffuse, but also wanting their piece of that federal pie. I mean, it's not a fluke that all the military bases are built in the United States in smaller states, Virginia and not West Virginia, Tennessee. Well, I'm picking states that have grown a lot since this was going on, but they were put in those areas because that was kind of the quid pro quo. If you want my support, Mr. Big State in the Senate, to get what you want passed, we need something back our way. And that imbalance has never existed. I'll tell you a real quick story. This is many years ago, back in the 80s. There was a opening up of quota off of Newfoundland for tuna, the big bluefin tunas, people remember. And tuna at the time was trading for somewhere around $200 a pound for bluefin tuna. And that quota was very much wanted by Korean fishermen, primarily, but also Japanese fishermen. So these are fishermen who aren't even in the same ocean. Okay, wanted quota off of Newfoundland, and of course, Newfoundland would be very interested in catching fish that literally were worth $20,000 and $30,000 a fish. And then boats. My friends had vessels that were, capable of doing it tomorrow. And it was announced that all of the quota was going to Korea. It was also announced at the very same day, not unintentionally, that a very significant wiper blade plant was being built just north of Hamilton by Trico to supply wiper blades to the Japanese manufacturers in Ontario. And the Hyundai was just becoming an entity at the time. And that was a quid pro quo, right? That was a quid pro quo. Do you think that happens if there's a Senate where Newfoundland senators have equal representation? Not in a minute does that happen, right?
Well,
That's the kind of stuff that Albertans don't hear about. Those are the kinds of disturbing deals. And the first one that Albertans really became aware of was the CF-18 contract that was pulled out of Manitoba and put in Quebec. And that was the beginning of the end of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Well, and the conservative movement has never really been united after that, and I think that's part of it, is that we observed this. I think there was some jubilance when Stephen Harper got elected, and then he did a couple of things for the West. He got rid of the long gun registry, he got rid of the Canadian Wheat Board, but then it was you have a leadership race that was centered around how do we win votes in Quebec, and I think that was part of Aaron O'Toole's problems, is that he wanted to get Western support, which he did to win the leadership, and then he changed to try to win support in Quebec. And that's, I think, one of the big frustrations, is that there does seem to be these kind of trade-offs, but I don't know that the trade-offs necessarily ever benefit the smaller regions. It does seem that it all flows in one direction.
I would also argue that the party is still divided around Laurentian Elite lines and the new Canada outlook. You look at what does Jean Charest represent, really? What did Aaron O'Toole truly represent? He represented that return to the elites. The policy book that his Man with a Plan policy book was a complete abandonment of the Conservative Party of Canada's policy documents. It was a betrayal, frankly, and that's why he got ousted, and it's why Jean Charest can't draw more people in my neighbor's garage sale this afternoon. Those elites are dying, and those elites are running in fear, and they're doing. They're going to do some pretty catastrophic things if they get a chance.
I hope not. Let's bring it closer to home,
Sure.
because I don't know if you want to comment on sort of our political environment that we find ourselves in right now, because I think it's also a very similar battle. This is what I've noticed what I loved about the convention was that I saw all my old friends from my PC days, because I was a PC from 92 to 2008. And then I saw all my old friends from the Wild Rose days, 2009 to 2015, all in one room together, going to the hospitality suites together, debating policy together. And it seemed to me like the merger has been successful. However, I think we still have this battle between having government run for the people and local representation and grassroots versus the elites. I think we're seeing this play out in Alberta too. Do you agree?
Like I said, we're seeing it everywhere. We're seeing elites under threat, under siege. Can I just take? I know this is relevant, I think.
Yeah.
And I think we would agree. And actually, Barack Obama just made a very, I think, landmark speech for how wrong it was this past week, talking about all the good old days when we only had 3 networks. And I'm sure there's people who reminisce and say it was so good back when we only had CBC and CTV, and that was it. And everybody talked about the same things at the water cooler. You and I would vehemently disagree. And we're literally on a format that is unimaginable 30 years ago. But I want to use a metaphor because I think it's so powerful to explain where we are. Because a lot of people think that social media is a terrible, terrible thing, that this new format is just such wrenching and so much destruction and turmoil, and people are at each other's throats and on and on and on and on. The Gutenberg press was invented. And the first guy who really used it, as you probably know, I know you know, was Martin Luther. And he went out and nailed his, 56 theses?
95 theses, I think. I came from a Catholic background. That was so Protestant will have to correct me.
Exactly, yeah. Theses with a T, not an F. and nailed them on people's doors, and the world changed. And almost overnight, this was as big an attack on elite as the world has ever seen. It was an attack on the Catholic Church. And it sparked the 30 Years' War, which was fought primarily a civil war in what we know now mostly as Germany and Austria. And over 60% of the people in that region died. 60% in 30 years. Now, I bet if we asked somebody in year 31, was the Reformation a good thing? Was the Gutenberg press a good idea? They probably would say no, it was a terrible idea, right? But today, we would say the Gutenberg press is one of the most significant, important ventures in human history. Social media, we're living in the Gutenberg 30 Years' War phase, and I probably won't survive long enough to see the much greater uplifting and positive end to it. But that's what's happening, is the elites are under threat because we have other channels to find out what's going on. This special general meeting vote that's happening doesn't happen without social media and all the ability to organize and oppose it. So the elites within the party, primarily it's the old PC party elite that had to swallow its angst and bitterness and join up with the Wild Rose Party to create the UCP. That convention that I was at, obviously conspicuously so, the discussions in the evening did get heated, no question about it. There were those who supported Kenny and those who thought he should go, and I was on record thinking that he should go, because the only divisive force, I think, in the UCP, and frankly in the province, in an even bigger level, is Jason Kenney. Within the party, when I was having those discussions, and I'm sure you had them too, nobody was really speaking out that he's been a great leader and this and that. They're just saying, if we get rid of Jason, who do we replace him with, right? And that's battered wife syndrome, in my opinion. That's somebody who says, I got to leave this guy, but if I leave him, I might be worse off. And you cannot run your life and you cannot run a party that way. And and the chicanery that's been going on, Danielle, you've heard lots. I've heard just recently some just absolutely horrifying reports of the kind of corruption and manipulation that's happening. It is, I was shocked what I heard on Thursday night.
I have said, and I should say it again, because I have talked to the Brian Jean camp, and they're of the view that the level of potential manipulation is low. There were 45,000 memberships that came in that weren't billed to one particular credit card. Those might be a little bit on the line, but they were surprised to see relatively few problems with the mailing list. Though I've heard personally of people who verified their address in the database for the UCP and then received their ballot, fortunately it came through to them with a totally wrong address on it. I don't know how that actually happens. Those are the kind of things that I've heard about, but I don't want to act as if I'm sort of quickly jumping over that to get to the next topic. Sure. What are you concerned about that you're seeing?
Well, first off, just to get the numbers right, I was told at a meeting it's public, I guess, for all intents and purposes, that the president of the party, on a call with over 35 CA presidents, said that 4,200, not 40,000, but 4,200 memberships, not attendance to the convention, but memberships were bought before the deadline using 4 credit cards in Jason Kenney's riding. And they called them white label memberships. Now, in our bylaws, the UCP bylaws, you're not allowed to buy a membership unless it's for you yourself or a family member. But the Societies Act, as you know, was changed just prior to deadline, not making that the rule for all societies. So they're not in legal jeopardy, but they've clearly contravened the intent of our own documents. So that's just one of many things, right? And they didn't buy. This is before the decision, quote unquote, was made. Not quote unquote, but before the decision was made to make it a mail-in ballot. So why would you buy 4,200 memberships and not buy the ticket to come to Red Deer if you didn't know that the board was going to change its mind and make it a mail-in ballot? Like, the manipulation that's happening is absolutely stunning.
It's a shame because it erodes trust. But what I would say is that if there's 59,000 members and there's 4,200 that are questionable, that still means that the majority of the memberships were probably bought legitimately. And so people should be encouraged to participate in the process. I'm worried that people are thinking...
Let's be clear. Boycotting the process is the absolute wrong thing to do. Okay. If you've got a ballot, fill it out, mail it in. But on that, I don't know if you heard about the kerfuffle over the postal coding of those ballots being mailed in, that postal code does not exist.
And I have talked to the Brian Jean team about that as well, because we used to do a lot of direct mail back in my day in politics. And when you do a large direct mail, this is what I was told, is that they assign you a special postal code, so it goes to an individual box. I'm encouraged that that is going to Deloitte, because that means that there is a chain of custody that stays with those who are auditing the vote. I understand that people have tried to put registered mail have found, the postal code doesn't match. But I was told by the Brian Jean camp, Vitor Marciano, that was actually justifiable and fairly routine. Are you still concerned about it, though?
I'm still concerned because I'm not sure where all those ballots are going. What concerns me more is the scrutineering of the ballots. So we'll have lots of people to look there and open the ballots, but only one person is allowed to see the entire ballot list. One person, Jason Kenney. So how do you scrutinize ballots when you don't get access to the membership list? How is that possible?
I'm going to have to do a follow-up on that as we get closer to it.
If I was to scrutinize a regular general election polling station, I have the list of voters for that booth, that polling station, and I match them up. How do you do that? Right? How do you do that when you can't access the list? So it's a ballot. It's got a guy's name on it, but I don't know if he's legit. I don't have any idea who he is.
It's so funny. That, I think, is how they do scrutineering at the municipal level. You're just supposed to say, hey, I was at an advanced polling station and I saw that guy and now here he is again. Like, who's going to be able to do something like that? I take your point that there probably needs to be a bit more work done.
If it isn't a landslide either way, like 85-15, if it's close, within 5,000 votes, it's a mockery, absolute mockery, and it'll always be in doubt. There are 14 or 15 appeals to the arbitrator about misconduct and all the things that are going on. And all of this chaos, all of this division, all this upset is because of one factor. And if that factor is gone, the party's as unified as it's ever been. Now you can say Brian Jean will be a divisive element if he's leader. I'm going to tell you that I don't think he's the only option. And I think there are options out there who would be more unifying. And more importantly, and I'm going to kind of trample over my own arguments, I guess, but if Jason Kenney is still premier in March or May of next year, I still think the UCP crushes the NDP. This isn't about the wealth, whether or not we beat the NDP. I think it's, do we want to have a party that's built on ethics and trust and what we say we stand for as conservatives, or do we return to the bad old days of the PC party and all the chicanery and inside track and frankly, Politburo level of command and control. And I don't know if you want to get into psychology, Jason Kenney. We had a good chat on the phone about that one day. But
we'll do that another day.
We'll do that another day.
See how things go May 18th. But it's the reason I decided that I wanted to jump back into politics as well, seeking the nomination down south, is that I think we do need to have a bit more of the wild rose culture reflected in the UCP for it to keep the parties united. But let's use the transition to talk about why it is the premier finds himself in trouble into the topic of healthcare. We don't need to talk about COVID in particular, unless you want to. But I think what we observe, regardless of whether you're on the vaccination side, getting your boosters, and 100% are behind the decisions the government made, or whether you want to take more time, because this is how I look at those who are described as being anti-vax, is they want to see the long-term studies before they make a decision, especially for their kids. So I'm very sensitive to both sides of the argument. So if we can put that aside for a minute, I think we can all agree that the healthcare system did not fail because of COVID. It was the healthcare system was already failing, and COVID just revealed it, that it did not pass the stress test. Is that if it was stress tested, it was an utter failure. And I don't want to celebrate when somebody gets fired. It's always hard when someone gets fired. But I said that Dr. Verna Yu should never have had her contract renewed. It was pretty clear that she was given the direct order to increase the number of ICU beds to an additional 1,089. And she absolutely, utterly failed at that task. In fact, if you look at where we said the stated number of ICU beds at the beginning versus partway through, they actually decreased them. And then they announced that they had a surge, which brought them up slightly. But our level of ICU beds is woefully inadequate for our level of population and our seniors population. The number of ICU beds that are able to support our various populations throughout the entire province is woefully inadequate. And the fact that they couldn't pivot and deliver, even though they were given 2 years to do so, it's no surprise to me that she was let go. I just think they should have brought some fresh perspective in a year ago. So I think that a lot of what is problematic that we're having right now is that we have a healthcare system that has failed us, but I don't know that we have the confidence that anybody in positions of power, whether it's an NDP or the current leadership in the UCP, know what to do about it. But you do. So give me your sense of whether or not you think my interpretation or observation is accurate, or if you disagree with anything.
Well, I think you're very much on, again, we come back to this elites discussion. And this COVID obviously has been a terrible, terrible thing for many, many reasons, but it's been a great, great thing in the long term. And I think one of the bigger benefits is it is, for a lot of Canadians, shattered their preconceived, frank smugness about healthcare, about how we should trust our bureaucrats to do the right thing. The biggest mistake, with only a few exceptions, politicians made around the world was to trust the bureaucracy to solve a solution to a problem that they'd never encountered before. When bureaucrats are paid to legislate, regulate, and operate. They're not paid to innovate. And what was needed to address the crisis that we had for ICU capacity required innovation. Can I read a quote?
Yes.
Okay. This is from a book by C.S. Forster, who wrote Horatio Hornblower. He wrote a book called The General about World War I and the generals. And of course, we know all the slaughter and bullheadedness that their attitudes caused the deaths of millions. So this is what he says about that. He says, accustomed only to nails, they had made one effort to pull out the screw by main force. And now that it had failed, they were devising methods of applying more force still, of obtaining more efficient pincers, of using levers and fulcrums so that more men could bring their strength to bear. They could hardly be blamed for not guessing that by rotating the screw, it would have come out after the exertion of far less effort. It would be a notion so different from anything they had ever encountered that they would laugh at the man who suggested it. Okay?
And isn't that a quote that applies to all bureaucracies, unfortunately?
That's exactly what happened. We gave it to the bureaucrats. You would say, hey, what about if we did some other way of vaccinating? How about, we pay... I suggested to Jason Kenney in a web session with him very early on when vaccines were coming out, let's pay everybody $150 to get vaccinated and pay them another $150. Let's pay them a bounty. There were so many people who were saying, well, I live east of Stettler. I only go to the Costco once a month. I'm not worried about my condition. And they're 80 years old. So they wouldn't get vaccinated. If you offered them $150 per shot, they'd be in tomorrow morning to get their vaccine. So, but that's again, the nail in the screw. All they saw was nails. The bureaucrat solution and the politicians that were in their sway, they just came up with more rules, more restrictions, more regulations.
Do you know what happened though, Gordon? It sounds like they ultimately took your advice, but they came after the bulk of people had gotten it.
And
so
what was the reaction of people? And it was a lousy $100. And everybody says, so I got gypped by not waiting. And my son, who got his vaccination, his roommate didn't, and says, hey, I'm going to go get $100 and kind of danced it in his, you know what I'm getting at? Like, that's just unbelievable what was going on. So on the ICU thing, and this was proposed to him by myself and others, do not rely on the Department of Health to do acquiring ICU beds. Alberta is one of the great logistics developers in the world, ATCO, all these guys. We're building massive camps up in the oil fields. Go to those providers and say, okay, we need 1,000 beds in these locations. Go negotiate with the Delta Hotel to take over the hotel downtown Calgary at, in 8 hours notice. Go get containers full of all the equipment to handle ICU. Go out and hire semi-retired doctors, retired nurses on an on-call basis. If we pull a switch and we need to fill that bed, you're getting $350 an hour to be the doctor. Whatever. Let them facilitate it. And they had the power, they had the political capital, but they didn't have the courage to face down their bureaucracy, to tell those generals that they don't know what they're doing. We're going to fire those generals and get new generals. And they They never fired the bureaucrat you're talking about, right?
But Gordon, this is by design. This is by design. It is by design that governments have decided that they end up offloading decision-making power to all of these agencies, boards, and commissions. And the Alberta Health Services is just one of those agencies. Give them a pile of money, hire one employee, so that anytime somebody comes along and criticizes, they say, oh, well, we have to leave it to the doctors. We have to leave it to the experts. We have to leave it to this independent agency. But it means that the vast majority of our spending, the vast majority of our healthcare dollars aren't under control of the people that we elect to oversee it. It's kind of bonkers, but it's by design.
Right. And when our healthcare system looks like it's failing, what do? They go to the bureaucrats and say, we need more money, right? And we need more control. So we need a super board or whatever. And to get back to the original start of this conversation, health spending accounts, just a little bit of background for the listeners, I guess. I'm just a meatball insurance advisor, as you know, Danielle, and I take care of about 450 groups through my company for health and dental benefits. We process through our providers in our group of 4 people, somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.5 million of drug and dental claims. So a year. I've been doing it for 20 years. So I kind of know how healthcare works. Clearly, the biggest thing developed in the last 30 years has been health spending accounts, and they're getting more and more popular and more sophisticated, frankly. To put a plug in, one of the providers I use is called MyHSA, which is developed in Calgary by a couple of guys I know. Truly groundbreaking technology, as good as anything in the world. using and expanding upon the use of blockchain for privacy purposes and audited trails. Excellent guys to deal with. We have literally got the systems and health spending accounts today in Alberta now to do the kind of things we need to do to make healthcare work. The broader spectrum, the whole spectrum.
So pause there for a minute, because people are a bit mad at me. I spent a whole week at a blockchain conference, and so my first 3 episodes this week were on blockchain. But I talked mostly about Bitcoin, because I think there's some really interesting things happening there, and have the potential to really create a new business industry group in Alberta and diversify our economy. But can you explain a little bit, because I took a blockchain course, and my project was HealthCoin, because I had this notion that you need to give people some kind of token so that we can start getting transparent pricing as they're going around using the various services. So I'm glad to see that somebody else has actually put that into practice.
The big thing about blockchain is the ability to protect privacy and audit trail. And what the last I remember talking to these guys about was they're looking to track fraud. So you move from one group carrier, get dental work done, you go to a new group carrier next month, and they do the exact same dental work and bill it. And you're breaking the law. Blockchain would be able, insurance companies, to share those data points and say, hey, that guy just got that done here, and flag it and penalize them without having to give up confidential information from one insurance company to another. Those kinds of, the technology is huge. And listen, Calgary is a massive leader in all this stuff. Alberta, I should say. I apologize to the rest of Alberta, but so health spending accounts. The whole key of a health spending account, in my experience working in benefits, is it delivers accountability. It's your money as the employee. You spend it how you see to be in your best interests, and the provider of that also is on the firing line. I go to a certain guy, what do you, this is not insurance. This is my health spending account. I need a new pair of glasses. What are you going to charge me for it versus what John down the street's going to charge, as opposed to some kind of standard fee schedule that an insurance company might pay. So introducing that kind of processing and accountability is absolutely key, because it's essentially a metric, and what's measured changes, and metrics matter, and the best person to be measuring whether it's working or not is the person who's getting the services provided, and it's their money. So as we've talked about, and I've harped on for many years now, Danielle, is, I don't know where you want to go with this, Danielle. I can give you kind of what the solution looks like.
Well, I want people to know sort of how you've mapped it out, because it's been quite influential on my thinking. And I know that you have quite a vision for where you'd take it. So here's what I've done with the idea that you planted with me years ago. What I feel like we need to do right now is we need to establish health spending accounts for every Albertan, and probably seed it with about $350. That's the number that's in my mind, because when I think about all of the collective trauma that we've suffered over the last 2 years and the different type of services people might need, they're all services that aren't covered by healthcare. So massage therapy and chiropractic and dietitians, nutritionists, the mental health therapy, psychologists, all of these things. I think if we gave somebody the mechanism to help take care of whatever issues they've had over the last 2 years, that would go a long way to healing our society and getting over the last 2 years of trauma. That would be one thing. But then it sows the seed of us having a broader conversation, because what I was thinking then is you'd say to Albertans, we will any dollar that we find in savings from our Alberta health system, we will forward to you in your health spending account. Now you've got 4.4 million Albertans rooting for you to try to find some efficiencies and savings in the healthcare system. So I look at it as being central to getting the buy-in once again that we can't keep doing the system the way that we are. So take that initial thought, because the other part that I would say, and this is where you and I might disagree, but one of the things that bothers me about a health spending account is that it does come to an end at the end of each year. And you don't really want to incentivize people to use up as much of their dollars as you can. Like, I might want to save up for laser eye surgery. I think I might need a little correction on one of my eyes. I got it done in 1999. I might want to save up for braces. Again, I've had them 3 times. Maybe I'll need a 4th. Maybe I'm going to keep myself healthy so that I have a little pot of money that when I get into long-term care, I'm able to use that to subsidize my long-term care. So I'm trying to think of how, if you create the incentives and you're increasing the amount each year. Let me add another part. You could maybe get employers to match what you have in the health spending account. Maybe you could put your own money in tax-free. So now you're actually growing up a pot of money that allows for you to take care of all the wellness parts of your healthcare, as opposed to just waiting to get sick and need hospital services, which is how we fund the system. So that's sort of how I'm envisioning it, and I want to hear what your vision is, since you got me thinking along these lines.
Okay, so let's, and this is a big thing we talk about Libertas. My meme for healthcare is it's the Everest of public policy, right? If we conquer Everest, if we fix healthcare, to use the term, that's like climbing Everest. And just like climbing Everest, you can't do it tomorrow afternoon. You and I can't have a couple of nice cocktails together and solve it and implement it tomorrow. There's a stages and process to do it. So you're on the right track. Let's start off with a modest health spending account that's voluntary on both the provider and the person who wants to take advantage of it. Set it at a fairly low number, let's say $350, and cover services that currently are outside of the public system right now, but are demonstrably medically beneficial for people. And the easy, frankly, that's not the right way to put it, but the low hanging fruit, the ones that would be quickest and easiest to implement, are the paramedical services. So paramedical services, acupuncture, naturopath, osteopaths, which are fascinating in the field that's really getting more and more traction, massage therapy, etc. And with that health spending account, you got $350. One of the big things in my world that I've learned a long time ago is you always have to have a copay, at least in smaller amounts. So you don't just get $350; it's at 80% coverage, or the optimal level. If when I read some research from Nadim Esmail years ago, the perfect number is 75%. They've done lots of studies on that. So 75%.
So just so we know how that works. So if you go to a chiropractic visit,
it's
$100, you pay 25 out of pocket, 75.
You can use your health spending account for the 75. Now it's voluntary. So you have to download the app off your phone. We all know how to do that. You go into the chiropractor and he says, I want to get a chiropractic service done. And he says, oh, I'm not signed up for it. Well, he goes online, he puts in his particulars. Most of these guys are all signed up online with various insurance companies. So the technology is out there. This is hardly inventing the wheel. He gets signed up and he gets paid through the system, through that app on your phone for his $75, and away you go. Now, the interesting factor is because it's voluntary. If I walk in and I'm not aware that this program exists, guess who's going to help me get enrolled? It's going to be the chiropractor.
The service provider. He's going to say, why not? You have access to this
We don't have to advertise. Let the service providers, they'll go out and get it done. And then, oh, by the way, Mr. Service Provider, you now have to publish what you're charging for services. And you have to allow the people who get your services to rate you. And I need to be able to go and say, hey, I want to get a massage therapy. I go on my app, my health spending account app. Who's the best rated? Who's the closest? Who specializes in knees or in back or neck issues? Who's got the, the right looking office, whatever we want, we should be able to get, but there's an accountability. I get to look. Okay, I get
very much like, because we're used to this because we use Airbnb, we use Uber, so we know what a rating system looks like.
Yeah, Amazon, all those stuff. So it's a meme that we're a way of dealing with. So once you've got that going, once you've got a lot of buy-in, I'm sure it'll be very popular. It's not going to bankrupt the system. People will understand how to work it. Then you start to expand into the things and work your way into the hospital environment. And then you say, okay, let's do diagnostics that way, right? Let's do doctors' visits that way. Now the doctors have to be accountable. Now the doctors but at the same time, allow the diagnostic shops to charge what they want to charge.
So let me pause you, because what that would mean is that if you were to then make diagnostics, and that would, I guess, that include the whole range, like MRIs and CT scans, whatever else, there's probably a certain additional, so that budget that we currently have allocated for that within the centralized system would get flowed through to the health spending account.
So let me put a pin right there for a sec. So let's say I've got $350 in my account and I don't use it. Okay. What we would say to you is, okay, if you don't use it, half of it stays in your account and half of it goes into what we're going to call a stop loss pool. Okay. And so if you run out of money, if you haven't got the funds, then you have to deal with drawing on the stop loss pool to cover the fact that you've run out of those funds. So 50%, 50%. So if you're healthy, that account builds and builds and builds. So maybe you go get your orthodontics or whatever. And there's always a copay built in. And then we slowly move further and further into health services. Now we're talking serious dollars. But now, because we're seeing competition, because we're seeing doctors being held accountable, and my ability to say, you know what, I need stitches in my, or let's move back to the hospital. I want to go see somebody about my knee. I want to go see a specialist. Well, a guy who specializes only in sports orthopedic injuries, he's $450 a visit. But my knee's just sore. I just want to spend $150. So let the doctors set their pricing. Let deregulate the pricing, right?
Do you think, okay, so here's the thing. I can see all of the services that are not currently under the legislation and not currently offered in other provinces. So call it Canada Health Act compliance services. I can see, or exempt, Canada Health Act exempt services. I can see those very easily being ones you can adopt. You get into difficulty when you start talking about doctor services and hospital services. And I don't know if you can bridge that gap without then having the federal government come in and pull back on your transfer payments, because that's always been the big hammer that they have. It's one of the things I find so frustrating. Your brilliant idea here runs up against barriers, because then the federal government could come along and say, so, all right, well, we're clawing back $4 or $5 or $6 billion.
And this is why I'm calling on Pierre Poilievre and others to say, we need to end the Canada Health Act. We need to say, let the provinces decide. Let's give the provinces the GST. Let's give the provinces tax points on the income tax to pay for their own services, and let equalization, that's another topic, fix equalization, and let it deal with filling in the fiscal limitations that certain provinces have versus others. Let the provinces be the provinces and do their jurisdictional duties, and get the federal government out of it. So,
okay, let me just talk. I want to get to the end, and then I want to come back and just see if you can answer some of the questions about why you see this a little bit differently. So let's say this starts for a young person, because I think young people increasingly are used to doing things on apps on phones, and I imagine they would pick it up quite easily. And so let's assume that you started at age 20 with this proposal that you have, and you have a reasonably healthy life all the way through. So you've got a pot of money at the end. I don't know if you've done some projections about how big that pot of money might be by the time you hit 65 or 70, but what happens then?
Well, here's what two things, and I have fond memories of us talking about this the first time many years ago, Danielle, is that let's assume we're covering a much larger scope of things, and we're covering them from childbirth, and let's say it's a $5,000 number. So if you don't spend the money, 2,500 stays there, and another 25 and another 25. So by the time you're 50, just to put a number out there, there's a $250,000 in there, whatever. How much would you pay me as a private insurer to cover you from a heart attack, so you don't lose that $250,000? And oh, by the way, when you turn 65, or pick an age, but let's say 65, that $250,000, now you get paid 5% of the balance every year as a pension. So it's your money. If you live a healthy life and that account accumulates and grows to that number, you get the money as a pension. And when you die, it goes to your kids tax-free, right? That's the thing. Now, the real key on this, and I want to come back because this is really, really important, because people say, well, what if my child is born with spina bifida or some horrific dread disease, and they're going to blow up their health spending account every year without fail? That's why there's the stop loss fund. Okay. The stop loss fund is half that balance that isn't used goes in to cover that. But the real hanger on this, and I could pinpoint exactly where I saw the light go on for you, was if it's your money, I'm buying insurance to protect the risk of my health spending account. By doing so, I am also paying premiums that indirectly protect the stop loss pool, because I've now buffered for my own self-interest. I bought insurance, but essentially that insurance is protecting the stop loss pool as well.
What I like about your proposal is that it does have this mix of personal autonomy, taking care of your own health, but it still maintains that community aspect of
Yep.
knowing that not all of our friends and neighbors have the same
Yeah.
health
Oh no,
status.
you're still if exactly. There's it's still universal. It's still a safety net. It gives you the choice. It gives doctors and other providers the ability to innovate, to be creative about how they do it, how they bill. We need to do the same thing in pharmaceuticals. We need to have a whole long discussion about the deregulation of pharmaceuticals. We need to let people innovate. Expecting Alberta, the super board, to be the innovator and finders of economies is ridiculous.
Well, it gets even
And
more ridiculous though, Gord, because now we're not talking about this kind of decentralization. We're now talking about Ottawa making the decisions about our
yes,
pharmaceutical
yep,
coverage, and
yep,
Ottawa making the decisions on our long-term care coverage.
yep.
And so it seems like you always do. We have these forces of centralization versus decentralization and government control versus personal autonomy. But I feel like that's going to be, we need to push back with something novel that has
Yep.
community buy-in.
Yes.
Otherwise, the default is going to be that Ottawa comes along, dangles a little bit of money, and then tells us that we've got to run it in the same old centralized
And
fashion with the same old bureaucracy. And we're going to end up with the same old problems.
it disappoints me to no end that you see Scott Moe and Jason Kenney not throwing it back in their face and saying we want nothing to do with it. And what you're seeing with pharmacare and dental care, even more so, is essentially what's going on in the States with Medicare and Medicaid. And anybody who knows anything about Medicare and Medicaid knows that it is an unmitigated disaster.
Mm-hmm.
In Orange County, there's what, 4.5 million people in Orange County. Medicare, Medicaid, there are, I believe, last I looked, 50 doctors in all of Orange County who will do Medicare and Medicaid services because what they're paying for the service is so low. And you're going to go and tell a dentist what they're going to charge for teeth cleaning? Like, forget about it.
Well, and I should also mention, I just did an interview with a woman who's involved in the tech space in healthcare in Silicon Valley. And one of the things that they're doing all kinds of approach with medical care, using the genome, doing testing, finding out what your predisposition is, and now you're doing tailored medicine. It's very expensive when it first comes on stream, but it will become less and less expensive as we go over time. But if we continue with the type of approach that we're taking, we're not going to be able to take advantage of some of the innovations that we're seeing in jurisdictions where they do allow for that personalized care.
When you have a monopoly and you have no price signal, to use Milton Friedman's term, I think he stole it from somebody else. When there's no price signal, when there's no accountability loop, you wind up with rationing of care, lowest common denominator levels of service, and worse outcomes. And that's exactly where we're headed. And that's where we're going to get further and further into until we start building in some accountability on both sides, both of the consumer and the provider.
So somebody's asking just for clarity about, please, Adela is saying, please clarify who is the financial contributor of this health spending account. I mean, I look at it as a three-party. Let me tell you my view on it, and you can tell me how you see it. I think it needs to be a three-party contribution, that the provincial government flows through a portion. You can match it if you want. Your employer can match it if you want, if they want to do it as well. Like, I think all of these innovations will develop. I bet as well for some of our low income populations, I bet there would be charities that would set up so that nonprofits could also make contributions to individuals' health spending accounts. It provides a mechanism to make sure that everybody has access to the kind of services that currently aren't covered by healthcare. That's how I see it. How do you see it?
At core, it would be the provincial government would provide that funding, and we based on whatever the costs of all the services being run. You'd have to be an actuarial calculation and how much we need to fill our stop loss pool, and that's why you kind of have to move it in on a gradual basis. But I could see there being obviously rules saying, hey, if you put cash into this account today because you had a good year for tax purposes, we'll let you write it off and expense it to your personal income tax or your corporate income tax. It stays in the health spending account forever. And if you use it for health services down the road, it comes out tax-free. Now, if you start taking it as a pension, maybe we have to tax it to some degree. But yeah, let you put your own money in there. You have a good year and you want to reduce your tax rate, throw it into your health spending account.
You've just described why it is we need to collect our own personal income taxes so that we can start developing these kinds of approaches.
Well, yeah. And I was going to say that we need to have so much more signals to consumers as to what healthcare actually costs, right? Once you know how much is being, you still hear it. We see it all the time. Healthcare is free in Canada. There's no bigger fallacy out there. If you looked at the Calgary Health Region, last I looked, spends somewhere in the neighborhood of $6,000 or $7,000 per resident on healthcare, something like that. Okay, let's say 6,000. So that means a family for $24,000. Okay, as a group insurer, if you gave me $24,000 and I could provide those services to you privately, do you know what kind of healthcare services we'd be providing you? It would be off the charts.
It'd be extraordinary, except for if you have something catastrophic happen, like cancer or heart disease, or
we'd be sitting down with Swiss Re. We'd be creating stop loss funds to take that care of that stuff. If we had the leeway to decide who our providers were. And oh, by the way, just a little sidebar on that. I'm working on an Apple computer. You're working on a computer. If the government, what we're doing in healthcare is basically mandating that all healthcare be manufactured and delivered in Alberta or in Canada. Why can't we send people to India to get their knees replaced? With a health spending account, it's $4,000 over there instead of $25,000 in Cambie, or 3 years wait, or 5 years. Sorry, 5 years wait in Saskatchewan for a knee replacement.
So let's think that through, because we do have a lot of folks who would travel internationally. So if you were planning on being in India or Malaysia or whatever anyway, and you needed to you wanted to convalesce with family or friends while you're there, then you would be able to put a little allotment for that in the health spending account, and then they could pay for whichever they like.
The same goes, and I'm going to have to put a mirror under my car tomorrow because I'm going to say this publicly, but we should do the same thing with Mexican dental services. Why shouldn't we allow people to use their health spending accounts that we're talking about to put towards implants or whatever, get it done in Mexico for 20% of the cost in Canada?
I know people who've done that, getting $20,000 or $30,000 quotes here, and then it's only $5,000 or $10,000 down there.
But we have no problem with the government of Alberta buying computers for its employees built in China or India, right? Why do we not allow Albertans to spend Alberta funded, provincial funded dollars outside of the country to get the service done for a fraction of the cost here? And what kind of cost pressures and delivery pricing pressures does that put on Alberta doctors and Alberta facilities? A lot.
It would, and that's what we need. We need competitive pressures to bring prices down.
We need price signals, right?
So let me ask you this, because anytime you implement a new program, I walked through an example for a 20-year-old, but what about somebody who's already 80 years old? There is a bit, so they already have higher health needs, probably, but they haven't had the benefit of building up an account over those years. There is a bit of an equity issue that I think we have to acknowledge, and I don't know how you would deal with that.
Well, I would argue that the 20-year-old never got the freeload on the healthcare system for the last 80 years like that 80-year-old has. Okay.
Well, so the 80-year-old has been able to use health services for the past. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
So that 80-year-old, they get the same amount of money in their health spending account as a 20-year-old gets. If they run out of funds, there's the stop loss fund, which is going to deliver services as good or better than what they would have had under the previous system. I don't think that is a substantive argument. And plus, it may be a way for an 80-year-old to put money into a fund on a tax. There's a lot of 80-year-olds I know who have certain tax issues that would love the opportunity.
Well, isn't it true? Well, once you get to be 71, you have a certain portion of your RSPs that have to be taken out.
Roll them in there.
Roll it over into your health spending account.
From your RIF into your health spending account.
And then you'd be able to have a pot of money that you could grow up so that if you do ultimately need long-term care,
maybe buy some insurance with it to protect you against the catastrophic.
Gord, let's just talk just in our final minutes here about, unless there's anything more on this, I think you've mapped out something really fascinating, and it's why it stuck with me all these years. I think I met you in 2009 where you planted this seed with me, and it really has been something that I've been thinking about what's politically possible. Everything we've talked about here today may not be politically possible, but we got to get started somewhere. But this is the thing that I find very frustrating is that, and I've said this before, what frustrates me about conservatives and conservative policies is that all we ever talk about is we want to generate more tax income through reducing taxes and having a better regulatory environment. So we grow the pie, and then we have all this new revenue, and then we hand it off to the same old central planning bureaucrats to run the system in the same old way. And what do? Well, they hire a bunch more bureaucrats. We have a bunch more money being wasted on administrators, and it stays within sort of this publicly funded, publicly delivered heavily unionized environment. So you hire more people who are very likely to vote NDP. So our success on the economy gets translated into more votes for the NDP because we have no vision for how it is to deliver all of the services people care about in a conservative way with conservative principles. What you've put forward, we're talking about individual autonomy over dollars. We're talking about having free enterprise, choice, markets, competition, privatization. There's still a sharing element to it, a community-based element to it. These are all beautiful principles on which to transform our public services, but do it from a conservative perspective with the things that we know work in free enterprise. Why doesn't it happen? What is wrong with us in the conservative movement that we haven't been able to articulate and get buy-in and implementation on ideas like this?
I would argue what you outlined there in the first portion of that, what is the red Tory ethos? Okay. It's in the American context, that's the Rockefeller Republican outlook. And that is, we support free markets. We support lower taxes because it generates more government revenue, which means then we can spend more government money and have government be more involved. That is the red Tory. That is Jean Charest in big, bold letters. That is Aaron O'Toole in big, bold letters. Pierre Poilievre, the one word you didn't use expressly was freedom. Okay. And I think that when we look back, I won't be around to look back, but when they look back, they'll look at the real start of all this was Preston Manning and then moving into Stephen Harper's tenure, the first real attempts to make government smaller, to bring in those kind of strategies, TFSAs, landmark legislation, all that kind of stuff, the wheat board. Pierre Poilievre, in my opinion, is the heir apparent to that. He's using the same rhetoric you're talking about. I think the Canadians are absolutely keen to see more of that. And it's all it all comes into one big ball that people realize we want more time. We want the ability to decide for ourselves what we want to do. We want the government to get out of our lives. And I think the ideas are coming. I think ourselves at Libertas, I know there are other people who are very keen in coming up with some really interesting ideas. And the more we get into that, the more we develop those things, especially with a leader and a party being led by somebody like Pierre Poilievre that is more open to those ideas and more determined to do those things, and has a mandate to do it. I think that one of the things that Stephen Harper had as a challenge was he was always on a knife's edge from a mandate standpoint. I think in the next election, we're looking at a Mulroney's first term level of mandate that the Conservatives get. And then they can do the things that, frankly, Mulroney, being the red Tory that he was philosophically incapable of executing on. So I think those ideas are out there. I'm not the only one, obviously. And there are a lot of people starting to push that ball down the road. We are, in terms of conservative ideas, where the United States was somewhere in around 1965, 66. We're always a little bit behind the eight ball on that stuff. But I think, frankly, in many ways, we're going to leapfrog the United States in terms of our ideas and innovations and conservative policies and thoughts. So
I sure hope so. You know what it is? It seems to me that a lot of conservatives act as if the only solution is to cut. So when you hear, oh, I'm going to cut, then a senior is thinking, oh my goodness, that's my pension, or that's my healthcare, or that's my long-term care. A mom thinks, oh my goodness, that's healthcare for my kids, or it's their university, or it's their education. I think we need to talk in terms of personal empowerment, individual sovereignty, putting dollars in the hands of customers and individuals so that they can pay for the services directly and hold them to account. And that does that. I mean, some people are saying, oh, are you saying there should be a greater role for government? I'm saying there should be a role for government, but it should be an appropriate role for government. And what we have right now is one where we're paying through the nose for all kinds of services. We know that we're paying higher than anywhere else. And we end up with taxpayers and recipients who are frustrated because it seems like a lot of it gets eaten up in the bureaucracy and administration and not at the front line. And I think we can fix that.
Yes. You're familiar with the Laffer curve. You probably wrote papers.
I know. I love the Laffer curve. You should, you know how I describe it. And if I have it wrong, you should,
go for it.
It's sort of this, it's if you were to draw a line starting at the bottom, you get a zero tax rate, you get zero government revenue. As you start increasing your taxes, you start increasing the amount of revenue until you get to a point where your tax rate becomes so high that ultimately, if you were taxing 100%, you're also getting zero revenue because no one is going to sit around and pay 100% of their income in taxes.
So a zero tax rate gets you $0. 100% tax rate also gets you $0. And somewhere there's an optimal point of tax versus that. And that's on a dollar sense. But there's also, in my opinion, a regulatory Laffer curve, where over-regulation, you get more and more diminishing returns and growth and worse results. That's what we have in healthcare. We're over-regulated in healthcare. We need to deregulate healthcare. We were that way with transportation years ago, and now we're seeing the deregulation of transportation. And guess what? We get way cheaper flights, way more flights to go on, and far more flexibility in service and levels of service. So we need to move back down the Laffer curve and from a regulatory standpoint.
Okay,
And
let me run one more idea by you. I don't think we've talked about this, but people have asked me what I think needs to be done in health reform. And so now people have a better idea of why I'm so excited about the potential for reform with health spending accounts. The other thing, though, is that we can't maintain this hierarchical system where we basically hand a check of $20 billion over to one person at the head of Alberta Health Services. So I've given some thought on how we should restructure healthcare. And I understand why we got rid of hospital boards. I remember back in the day, Ralph Klein said that we had hospital boards that had no hospitals, that there had already been some consolidation, but the infrastructure and administration stayed in place. So it started with that notion that, come on, we've got to right size this. I think the error that they made is that this is what I would have done if we could have done it again. For every facility needs to have its own board. And I have some experience on this because I was on the Calgary Board of Education, which is just way too big, way too many schools to have a personal relationship. And I was on the board of Weber Academy. And so I've seen that you can actually have a very effective local board and you can be more involved in the decisions. So if you went back and reestablished hospital boards, and I think we've got 100 facilities under the AHS umbrella, we also know that the province is pretty evenly divided with a major center in Fort McMurray, Grand Prairie. Then, of course, you've got Edmonton, Red Deer, Calgary, Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, and then over in the east, you'd have a Cold Lake. So make sure that each of those centers has a robust regional hospital that can provide most of the services that people will need. And then you can have all of your individual hospital boards send a representative onto that regional board. But we also know that Calgary and Edmonton have services that only they can provide. You look at NICU, for example, the intensive care units for newborns, or you look at transplant surgery or brain surgery or whatever. There's going to be some high-level things that can only be done in Calgary and Edmonton, which is why each of those regions needs to send somebody to a central board so some of the planning and coordination can take place. So you actually get the benefits of coordination, but you push the administration down to each of the hospitals where it should be, where they're going to have salaries that are not stratospheric, where you're probably actually going to have more people doing some administration and some hands-on work. And then you could start hollowing out that layer after layer after layer of middle management. So I think there needs to be some kind of companion governance change. That's my notion of it, but I bet you've got some ideas since I know you think a lot about governance. What would you do differently?
I think the reason why the model struggles currently is there is no price signal in that model. Okay, there's no what does it cost to get a stitch done at an ER on a Sunday afternoon compared to if you went to a clinic that was open and was being run by a semi-retired doctor, right? We don't get those choices. But clearly there are essentially monopoly elements within the healthcare system. Like you said, there's only so much intensive care, things like that. But we should treat monopolies, once we've got the price signal in place and price system in place, they should be turned into utilities. We should regulate them like a utility. Give them autonomy. They do what they have to do. Now, utilities basically formerly used to work on a cost plus model. They don't any longer. They work on a cost plus, but if you innovate, you get to keep some of the innovation as a profit. So they devise more efficient and better ways to do what they have to do. They also have as you know, utilities, power delivery companies have enormously high levels of standards that they have to meet to stay in business. So, healthcare, we can have just as onerous standards there as we need. So, but also allow, just like we see in telecommunications, there's your phone that you can get to your house and cable and whatnot, but there's, where there isn't a monopoly environment, you let other providers get in there and fight it out for that dollar and that need. So I think that once you've got the price system starting into that, then you give that autonomy truly gets to flex its muscles and starts to say, hey, let's run our ER a different way. Let's innovate and not have to. It's just beyond me why people think that the answer to a problem is to make an ever greater and stronger and more regulated monopoly. Where in all of the world has that ever worked?
But conservatives always do that. Like we're our worst enemies because we were the ones.
We allow people to bracket us as cut and uncaring, uncompassionate people, right? And that is absolutely wrong. And I think that what's really flipped the dime with Pierre and other people who are now deploying the freedom rhetoric, DeSantis the same way, is that we're still going to be there for you. We're still going to provide those things. We're just going to give you way more options and ability to seek what you need, what you see in your best interest. We're not going to tell you what you need to do or how to do it. We're going to let you do it the way you see fit in your best interests.
And it's going to be better.
Way better. And it needs the other thing that the thing that frustrated me so much about Aaron O'Toole and frankly Andrew Scheer is that they weren't aspirational in their messages. Was there a worse political message than secure the future? Right? That's a defensive crouch. That's what that is. It's not let's create the national dream. Let's create a transportation utility corridor from coast to coast.
It's like own the podium, own the future. Like we've got to
and give people something to aspire for and see how it works. And that's why, getting back to the health spending account, even at little small start with $350 or whatever the number is, you get buy-in. You get people saying, hey, I like this. I want more of that. If there's one thing when I deal with group plans, when I talk to employees, what do they want more of? We'd really like a bigger health spending.
Isn't that something?
Right. We like the flexibility.
Well, I don't know if you've got any final thoughts. We've gone on for a little bit longer than I thought we would. And I'm just delighted to have had this as our first long form interview because you have been so influential on my thinking over the years. And I've always enjoyed our conversations. And I wanted people to especially when you stand up to the mic at the next UCP convention, to know just how much knowledge and research is behind the policy proposals that you put forward and argue. But is any final thoughts that you want to give us today?
Well, first off, Danielle, when I got the email from your assistant saying that you wanted me the first person on your long form, I was absolutely flattered beyond the pale. I was so thank you very much for the opportunity. People say, how can you be, all these things, and then we're seeing terrible things happening in our society and affronts on freedom of speech and all freedom to move, etc. But I am long-term extremely optimistic about where this country could be and where this province could be. And the only impediment to that greater, brighter future is ourselves. Mm-hmm. We have to get over ourselves. And I'm going to take the opportunity because I got it. I've long felt that Canada is a global embarrassment, that we have the riches that we have the peace and security that we have, and that we have squandered so much of that opportunity over the last 100 years is a national disgrace, an international disgrace. We need to become and to not squander and truly become a beacon. We should be the richest country on earth by a country mile. We should be one of the most important military and diplomatic powerhouses in the world. We should be what people look forward to. And the only reason why we aren't is our own bloody fault. But we can fix it. I see changes in our demographics, to get back to that meme. Going forward, we have the opportunity to make this the greatest country on earth. And I very much think we won't squander it. It's not going to be an easy road, but I don't think we're going to squander it.
Well said. Thank you so much for your thought leadership. I sure appreciate your time today. That was Gordon Tulk. And thank heavens we managed to attract him here from Newfoundland and Labrador so that we have this great thinking put to the problems of the day. I'm going to try to do more segments like that where we talk aspirationally about what we can do, what we can be, because I think that we spend a lot of time beleaguered and a lot of time complaining about the way in which we're being treated. But if you look at the theme that we've had over the past 4 days, and I hope I can continue this, I can be a little negative sometimes too. I can be a little bit of a critic sometimes too, but we can solve our own problems. That's really the main takeaway. And we just have to be a little more innovative about how we approach the problems so that we can do that. So thanks so much for tuning in to this very first episode of the long form Danielle Smith Show. And we look forward to doing this guys again. We'll do this again next Saturday. Thanks again.